Speaking of great dynasties, Cleopatra is a docudrama that was on Netflix, which is supposed to be highlighting the life of Cleopatra, another somewhat dynastic ruler, an incredible historical figure, someone that many would argue story is incredible enough that it doesn't really need a Hollywood makeover in order to make it effective or efficient. This docudrama seems to have too much drama and not enough docu, right? And people have absolutely trashed this show. It's a multi-part docu-series on Netflix right now. It has officially the lowest reviews on Rotten Tomatoes ever. Ever. And that's actually interesting because if you don't know how Rotten Tomatoes works, it's a movie and video review website, and it allows for an audience score. So that's just normal people like you and I can go on Rotten Tomatoes. We can give it a 1 through 100 rating, and then we can give a review of it. And then there are critics, and they have to be like acclaimed critics. It can't just be you and I. It has to be a real critic. And so you have the critic score and you have the audience score. And what you're seeing a lot of times in modern movies, especially, is you will see those as almost inverses of each other. And so a movie comes out like Captain Marvel in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and it has an astonishingly low audience score. People don't tend to like it. People review bomb it. And, there's some politics involved there. But then it will have a really high critic score. And, you go to something like the Mario movie that just came out. It has a pretty like substandard critic score, really low, and then like a 98% audience score. The audience loves it and the critics hate it. And the inverse is often true. The critics love it and the audiences hate it. And usually that's because the critics are coming at it with a certain political bias or a certain political bent. And they're looking to make sure, the Academy Awards, they just put, this is kind of in reference to what the critics are looking for. They just put some standards on movies in order for them to be accepted into nomination for the Academy Awards. And all of the things are based out of, political ideologies. And so that's a lot of what the critics are looking for. Does it check the ideological boxes that I'm looking for? Does it say the right statements? Does it have the right quotas? Does it have all these things? And the audience is generally saying, did this movie move me in any way? Was it compelling? Did the character development make sense? Was the plot too predictable? Just thinking like a normal person would, whatever the narrative and scope of the movie is. Did I like it or did I not like it? And so often I will joke with Katie that if it has really low critic score and really high audience score, I'm probably going to love the movie, and the inverse is often true as well. It doesn't matter that much if the critics don't like it. I say all that to say both the critics and the audience hate this show. Cleopatra had, like last I looked, a 13% from the critics. Those are the people who are looking for specifically the political ideological stances, and a 3% on the audience score. So this is like worse than the worst movies ever. This is like way lower than the Adam Sandler film Jack and Jill, which I haven't even seen. I've seen one clip of, and it made me so frustrated. I knew I could never watch the movie. This is like far, far, far lower than that. The cringiest, craziest movies ever made are nowhere near as bad as Cleopatra currently sits on Rotten Tomatoes. And it's not alone in the issues that it addresses. So there's controversy surrounding Cleopatra movie because this is part of a series that is produced, I think, in part by Jada Pinkett Smith, Will Smith's wife, where they are highlighting the power of Black female historical figures. The issue is all of the best evidence suggests that Cleopatra was not a Black woman. And as a matter of fact, there is a group that in Egypt itself who is now suing the makers of the Cleopatra movie because they feel like it is detrimental to their history. They're actually quite offended by it. And a lot of people are saying that the low audience and critic scores are because of that fact that there's some racist and biased undertones. Look, racism exists and racists exist, and so I'm sure some of those reviews fall into that category. However, it is usually meeting some of those politically correct racial, equality metrics that drive the critic score through the roof. And the critic score also being so incredibly low, would tell me there's way bigger problems than just the race swapping of Cleopatra. And to be completely fair, I have not seen this docuseries. I'm not going to see this docuseries. The research I did seems to show that the problem isn't just ideological when it comes to the decision they made to cast someone who is not the same race as the Greek Cleopatra. The problem is in the storytelling itself, is in them going out of their way to make Cleopatra look powerful, and like everything she did had a higher purpose than it did. Everything dramatized to the point where it just becomes factually inaccurate, which is fine if you're just making a historical drama. It's not fine when you're putting something out as a documentary. And really what this comes down to, all of that to say, is in modern cinema, we have a problem of ideology versus mythology. When I say mythology, I'm not saying that that is synonymous with fiction. As a matter of fact, fiction, by definition, is something that is entirely made up, something like Harry Potter. There was not a young man named, Harry Potter, who they are fictionalizing, and there's not a real Hogwarts school, right? Mythology is rooted in something historical, or at least perceived to be historical. And even when we talk about the great truths of ancient scripture, which I actually do hold as reliable and real and factual, even those are mythological in the sense that great mythologies do a few things really well. Number one, they create archetypes of both people and situations. An archetype is a representative of some of the deepest of human conditions or experience. And so the characters in there will be archetypes like the devouring mother, the Oedipal mother who holds her children so closely that she suffocates them or eats them, in some of the crazier mythologies, and keeps them from developing any skills and wraps them in this tight bubble where they're never able to actually go out and do anything in the world, which is exactly what the devouring mother wants. She wants the kids always coming back to her for protection and never lets them set loose on their hero's journey. Or the tyrannical father, there is the reluctant leader. There's all these deep archetypes that speak to some of the deepest experiences of what it means to be human. There's these situations, these trials and tribulations, triumphs, comedies, disappointments, all of these moments in these great grand mythological narratives that just speak to us at the level of our human condition. They speak to us at the level of our soul even. Mythology is like these texts, a lot of them from the ancient world, that have been read and studied and interpreted for thousands of years now. And a true mythology, a true great work of art, is something that the deeper you plumb the depths of the meaning and the nuance of what that narrative has to offer you, it's like just the more expansively deep you realize it actually goes. Then you have ideology. Ideology is a carefully constructed set of beliefs that is normally played out through very well-defined talking points and narratives. One way to say it is the problem of ideology, which is what we're getting in modern cinema, versus mythology, which is how narratives have been constructed historically, is kind of like the problem between prescription and description. Mythology is a description of the human experience. It's a description of how life works. It's a description of the hero's journey. It lays out the hero's journey from their equilibrium, their life that is fine and innocent and stagnant, into an inciting incident that calls them into action, into tension and climax where they're not only trying to fight against external foes, but more importantly, they're being developed in their character, and their character development ultimately will lead them to where they can slay the dragon or climb the mountain or overcome the obstacle and live in triumph, or where they succumb to their worst ways and ultimately live in tragedy. That's mythology. It's the description of that allows you to draw deep, complex, nuanced thoughts out of those and apply it to your life. Ideology isn't description, it's prescription. It's here's how you have to live, and here's exactly how to be a good person, and there's no nuance to it. And I'm going to lay it out point by point for you. And ideology, political ideology, racial ideology, gender ideology, sexual ideology, all of these things that are being just infused into modern movie making and into modern Hollywood, they are killing the epic adventure that narrative is supposed to offer us. They're really destroying the art of what it means to tell a great story. So what are some of the issues for ideology versus mythology? One of the problems with ideology is it does simplicity in the place of complexity. Ideology takes the complexity of myth and makes it painstakingly simplistic. Complex ideas and the search for truth are replaced with cheap talking points and predictable choices. You know, very rarely do we walk out of a modern movie and go, man, I'm going to have to think about that for the next 85 hours. Like, I'm going to have to really wrap my brain around the deeper themes of what was going on there. I'm going to have to really contend with whether the main character made the right choice or not. Usually we walk out of a movie and we're like, okay, yeah, I get it. Like, oh yeah, the person did the thing and they were inherently good and they were inherently bad. And, they tried to give some nuance to the characters, but at the end, they just kind of told us, simplicity in the place of complexity. It strips the complexity out of the characters because to allow them any range of choices possible could put them in a politically incorrect position. Another problem with ideology versus mythology is it relies on absolutes rather than nuance. A hero's journey requires diving into the gray areas of life, the river of chaos. Ideology has an allegiance first and foremost to its moral absolutes, removing the exploration of nuance of character development. And so part of the hero's journey is being forced with decisions that are painstaking. They're very difficult, and you don't actually know what's right and what's wrong. And you have to go through a journey and dive deep into yourself. Sometimes, you have to go to the depths of the ocean in one of the great mythologies. And sometimes you have to metaphorically kill the devouring mother or kill the tyrannical father. You've got to go through all of these very difficult choices. And every one of those choices leaves the person who is reading that narrative or watching that narrative on a movie screen. It leaves us almost in this conundrum where we're having to do the work of trying to figure out the nuance of that and what we would have done in that situation. Instead, you have a show like the Disney Plus show Falcon and the Winter Soldier. And at the very end of it, Falcon just gives this speech. He just explicates, here's what this show is about. You guys need to do better. This isn't right. You guys have done wrong. Here are the absolutes of how we are supposed to structure ourselves. And anything other than that is a heresy. Another problem with ideology is that it does telling in place of showing. Narratively, especially in filmmaking, where you're able to actually use images, moving images. It's always been known. It's like a cardinal rule: show, don't tell. Don't just use someone narrating everything that is supposed to happen. Just show them what's going on. Show them through the actions of the characters. Show them through the conversations that the protagonist is having with the guide, with the Gandalf who's walking them through, with their enemies. The conversations they're having internally with themselves. Don't just tell. And we even see this, like, y'all know I'm a huge Survivor fan, and one of the complaints that fans have had recently is instead of just showing us the characters and allowing us to find out about the nuance of the character through their actions, through their conversations that they have back at camp, instead they're just telling us. And so you'll go to an interview, on the beach with one of the castaways, and all of a sudden it will just do kind of a video transition into pictures of them back home and videos of them at their wedding, and a heart-wrenching story about when their mother got sick, and there's videos of them with their mom in the hospital. And number one, it pulls you out of Survivor. All of a sudden you're back in the real world. They're not dirty and stinky and 20 pounds, underweight anymore. They're just like their normal selves out of the normal world. And it is effective. American Idol is doing more and more of this. They give you the backstory and they tell you all of it. And it's just narrated for you of why you should care about this person and who they are and what character qualities they have and why they're a good person or why they're a villain, instead of letting us discover that on our own. And when you allow the reader or the watcher to discover that on their own, they form a connection with the story, and they have a point. They have and they have an opportunity, there it is, to learn this for themselves and to gather the information for themselves. Last, ideologies fall into preaching instead of provoking. Instead of provoking out of you the purpose of the story, the purpose of the narrative, instead of provoking you on your own to discover that the reason the character triumphed was because they were willing to make massive sacrifices earlier in the narrative that paid dividends later, instead of provoking you to the realization that you need a guide in your life like Frodo needed Gandalf in his life, instead it will just preach. And this goes back to them just explicating and narrating and simplifying and dumbing it down and making these deep things that we should be able to explore together into these really cheap talking points, hitting you over the head with simplistic allegories, direct exposition, patronizing speeches, acting like everyone in the audience is an idiot at best and a bigot at worst. And this movie is here to preach to you and make you feel bad about yourself. Nobody likes that. And it is damaging cinema. It is creating these massive $100 million flops. And I do think it is why Cleopatra is the worst rated movie of all time. Interestingly, in the biblical narratives, and you could say the biblical mythologies, understanding that mythology is not synonymous with fiction, you have stories where the characters are deeply nuanced. And in a lot of religious text, the main protagonists of the religious stories are sheltered from their worst ways. Something very interesting about scripture is the main characters are presented flaws and all. We see that in basically every main character other than Jesus. And one of the most shocking is Jonah. I mean, Jonah is a bigot. He does not want to go to Nineveh because he does not want the Ninevites to be saved. He cares about Israel. That is what he cares about. He cares about his people. And God calls him directly to go, and he runs from God. This is him with an inciting incident, in this case, God directly speaking to him, and then him moving into his worst ways and being thrown into chaos that he now has to navigate. And he comes to a point of self-sacrifice where he is willing, in the midst of the storm on the way to Tarshish instead of Nineveh, to sacrifice himself to save the crew. And so, the narrative uses all of this tension and all of this chaos and all of this trial in order to form a new understanding and character development in Jonah. And interestingly, he ends up going to Nineveh. God does a great work, and Jonah's pissed off about it. I mean, Jonah is just left at the end of his book of the Bible, kind of like just this cowering crybaby. And it's beautiful. You look at the story of Cain and Abel, which is the first siblings that are represented in scripture, the first siblings in the genealogy. And man, in 10 sentences, you have a depth of insight there, a depth of knowledge, because at the end of it, it doesn't come out and just exposit exactly the 3 points that you need to take away if you want to be a good person. Instead, it tells this rich story, so rich in only 10 sentences, it is actually mind-blowing that you could study for the rest of your life and still be pulling wisdom from, because it is not framed as ideology. It is framed as the deepest form of story possible.